What's going on, everybody? I'm James Young with James Young Photography, and today we're talking about what's in my bag. What is the gear that I use to accomplish the things I accomplish with photography? Well, the first thing, we're gonna talk about the bag. This is the bag that I use for every single wedding. You probably see me rolling it around like I'm some bum off the street. But in it is actually a lot of really cool gear, and I love cool gear, so let's talk about it. The first gear is gonna be my camera body of choice, and that is the 5D Mark IV. I have two of them. I gotta have two, one just in case. Absolutely favorite camera body right now in the Canon ecosystem. There's other camera bodies that I would love to have, but I am not made of money. The biggest reason to have two camera bodies, or even more depending on how conservative or liberal you want to be with your risks, is while of course I have all of my equipment insured, the best insurance plan is to just have redundancy across your gear. My insurance plan is not going to help me out on the day of a wedding or on location or while I'm traveling and my camera breaks. I'll get that camera eventually, but having one on your person is going to be the absolute best bet. I always recommend having two. Now into the lenses, I've broken this up into my zooms and into my primes. The first zoom is going to be the 16-35 2.8 version 3. This lens is going to be used most often, of course, for wide angle shots. It's a 16-35. 16 on a full frame sensor is super wide. It's amazing. It's about as wide as I've certainly ever need. And my favorite use for it is actually for vlogging and doing talking head type things, where I'm pointing the camera at myself, and having that 16mm focal length is super cool, so that my big giant head doesn't take up the whole frame. My next zoom is the 24-70 2.8 L version 2. What makes this lens so great is the versatility with the focal length involved. We're talking 24mm, which is exceptionally wide, especially on a full frame sensor, all the way to 70mm, which is very close to a telephoto type length. So it really is good for some portraits, especially when you're in a pinch and you don't have a lot of space to step back. That 24-70 focal length is gonna treat you just right. Next up on the zooms is the behemoth, none other than the 70-200. This is the 2.8 IS version 2. In terms of zooms, especially if you're doing weddings, even for some scenarios with sports and things like that, this lens is going to do just fine. In terms of weddings, again, I'm a wedding photographer, so it allows me to capture the action without being all up in the action. It allows me to be a fly on the wall and not a participant in the wedding. It makes me a lot less obvious since I'm not 2 steps away from the action. It allows me to step back just a little bit and allow the action to unfold in front of me and still get a nice tight shot so I can fill the frame with exactly what I want and not have to be too close up. My next zoom lens, I actually treat it more of a prime lens, and this is probably my most peculiar lens. This is the 8-15mm f4. And what's crazy about this lens, this is actually Canon's fisheye lens. This is their L fisheye lens. And this of course creates a very, very specific look for a specific goal. Very few times does this leave my bag except for the very, very thought out process of creating a fisheye image. While that type of image has been made very popular by like skateboarding and extreme sports and things like that, I do believe that there is a spot in my bag, at least, for the fisheye lens, especially for weddings and things like that. When you center your subject, the warped effect and the bowing of the edges of the frame can look pretty cool around a static subject that is thoughtfully placed in the middle. Now moving on to our prime lenses, I'm just gonna go from shortest to longest. This is the only non-Canon lens that I own. This is the Sigma 50mm 1.4 Art. While I am a huge advocate of shooting the same brand on the same camera, things like that, at the same time, I'm also gonna go with what I believe is the best case scenario. And from what I've experienced, I just opted to get the Sigma Art instead of the Canon 50mm 1.2L, simply because that lens is just so old and it just doesn't compete with the 50 1.4 Art at this time. As soon as Canon releases a new 50mm, there's a good chance I'm gonna get that. Next down the line, this lens is pretty legendary for me. This is Canon's 85 1.2 version 2. In terms of bokeh, in terms of just creaminess, oh my goodness, this lens is the one for portraits. I love this lens. Granted, it's super expensive, but it is worth every penny if you already have the zooms associated with the focal lengths that you're after. There's kind of a newer version of it out. It's technically not the same lens, but it is an 85mm 1.4L IS. That is on my radar. However, it's hard for me to replace this lens because I'm not unhappy with it at all. And it's hard to spend that much money on basically a focal length that already exists that is literally in my hands right now. But hopefully soon in the future, I can acquire the newer 85 1.4. Next up is my 100mm 2.8. Now this is the USM version, this is not the L. So this is my only Canon lens that is not an L lens. And when I got it, I simply didn't have a use for the features associated with the L version. The L version, from what I have seen, has not really been optically superior in any way in terms of the final output. So I didn't see a reason to get it for the IS. All that would do for my circumstances is make the lens heavier, and this lens is extremely lightweight. It's been totally reliable and I love it. I have no problems with my macro shots at all with this lens. And my current longest prime lens is the 135 F2L. This is probably my favorite portrait lens of all time. Granted, you do have to be pretty far back, pretty far away from your subject, but man, does this render some backgrounds. This right here is like the creamiest of the cream fest of all bokeh, man. I love the bokeh that this renders. You guys know I love my bokeh backgrounds. This is the one. And it's so cheap too, compared to so the 85 1.2, this thing is like almost 2 grand. This right here, it retails for $1,000. You can get it used for like $600-700 bucks. And man, the value associated with this lens is absolutely insane. I recommend this lens to every single portrait photographer whose longest lens is like 50mm or something like that. Definitely get a 135. Yes, you do have to be pretty far back from your subject, but yes, it is so worth it. Your work will definitely stand out with the 135. My only regret with this lens was waiting as long as I did. So again, you can see that there is some overlap here between my zoom lenses and between my prime lenses, but that has to do with redundancy just in case. So you know what, if my 70-200 takes a dump and I have to get it fixed, or I have to get it replaced from Canon, I have to get it replaced from insurance, guess what? I got 85, I got 100, I got 135, I got my bases covered. In addition to, yeah, I like having a much wider aperture, it really is a method of an insurance policy for me. So if any one of my lenses goes out, I'm not totally screwed. So if my 24-70 goes out, I have my 50 on hand, I have my 16-35 on hand, and I'm not 100% screwed by that situation. If my 16-35 goes out, I got my 24-70 to have myself covered. So while there is an artistic choice involved with all the lenses that I do currently own, there is also a very practical application to having an array of lenses at your disposal. And of course, every single one of these choices is totally up to you, and what you should buy next coincides largely with your budget and the job at hand. So those are both qualifiers involved with that choice. And there is, of course, a link in the description for every single one of these lenses, so you can just scroll down and check it out and see the current prices involved. Well, I'm James Young with James Young Photography, and that's what's in my bag.